Welcome to another Nights of RGB Soundbite. Today I have the honor and the pleasure to talk to Franzisca Weder of the IACA, and I would ask her to introduce herself. Hello,
Hey,
Franzisca.
and hi. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And well, where to start? I'm zooming in from Brisbane in Australia, and this is where I currently am and live with my family, and I'm working for the University of Queensland. I do a lot of research and teaching in the area of sustainability communication. So, this is an area that sits somehow between environmental communication, climate change communication, science communication, and the area of strategic communication. And yeah, especially what we call CSR communication, so corporate social responsibility communication, which includes all kind of small and bigger companies and corporates that do communicate about responsibility and ethical, better behavior and sustainability for quite a while now. So it's really interesting what role they played in terms of defining the sustainability story for us as individuals, but also for other organizations. And this is what I focus on in my research, and which I try to inspire my students to think about sustainability. And it's a bit of a challenge sometimes because here in Australia and Brisbane at this university, particularly, we teach a lot of international students, and they come in very different cultural backgrounds, a very different understanding of sustainability. So that's something we potentially talk about. And this fits quite nicely to my role as chair of the IECA that you mentioned, the International Environmental Communication Association, a pretty cool network of researchers, academics, scholars in those fields that I mentioned, environmental and climate change communication predominantly, and then practitioners, artists, NGO people, campaigners, photographers, visual artists um, that yeah, try to better understand how we can improve our communication about the environment, about climate change, about sustainability, and how can we improve the communication for change and for a transition process that we're in anyway. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Which is a lot already. Thank you so much. What I found really interesting when I was reading your article about sustainability as a social and cultural practice. Could you elaborate on that a bit? What do you mean by it, and how you think it could be implemented, and where it could be implemented, and how this sort of maybe expands to society as such?
Yeah, sustainability is definitely one of those blurry, fuzzy, wicked terms as it is described in the literature quite a bit. It is something that we all kind of know. We all have a feeling for what it might mean, and we might have an individual interpretation of it. So we do something, we don't fly to a place, but we take the train, or we go by a bike and not by a car, or we choose a certain diet, we don't eat meat anymore. And those decisions are increasingly connected to sustainability. What is the reason behind that? The reason behind that is that there is a lot of sustainability communication around us that gives us an idea of these sustainable behaviors, of these individual ways to do better. And the communication that is around us and that I am really interested in is that's kind of the context or the foundation for all those social representations of sustainability. So what the society believes or thinks that sustainability is, even there is not like one definition. So as I said, there are loads of these social representations around us, things that we perceive as more or less sustainable. And the reason why they are outside is an increasing amount of sustainability communication, which happens not so much in the traditional media environment. So there's not so much stuff on sustainability in the newspapers, in magazines, in TV news or TV documentaries. However, as I said before, there is a lot of communication coming from corporates in their marketing efforts, in their advertisements, in their PR and communication campaigning, in their reporting on their websites, in their engagement, in their corporate activism. So it's a huge area. And then, of course, we do have social media. We do have those platforms where increasingly influencers communicate about their avocado sandwiches and their reworked jeans and things they do. And so we do have those associations. So sustainability or sustainable behavior, there is a lot of information around that out there, and we as individuals try to make the best choices. We are influenced by that, but by the same time we try to find our own way to act sustainable. So that's probably kind of one bunch of thinking, if you ask me, for this kind of social perspective on sustainability. But of course, if we go a bit deeper and think about what sustainability is from a kind of conceptual perspective, then sustainability is definitely more than an idea. It's more a principle of action. So it is principle or an organizing principle that guides our action. Sometimes I talk about sustainability as a moral compass that kind of helps us to make decisions that are somehow related to this normative framework of sustainability, social responsibility, of environmental sustainability, and of course not to forget these kind of economic or rational perspective of sustainability. Hopefully that wasn't too theoretical.
I think
but this is a bit of the thinking that I deal with.
So I really like the idea of sustainability as a moral compass, as it's so connected to our, I just assume this now for everybody, but our like desire to do something good and not to do something bad for our environment, or basically for our livelihood as such. And so there is always a little bit amount of guilt, I think, also involved. And I found this really interesting. I read about your study on storytelling in narratives of sustainability, and how people were, I don't know if I understood it correctly, but people were sort of, when they were talking about their own situations where that they realized some aspect of their actions as sustainable or unsustainable, it was always connected with a proper amount of guilt, or I didn't do that right, or I should have done better. So I find that quite interesting, as how we can think about also representation of sustainability that is not either guilt driven or completely random in a visual way.
I think there's like guilt is there, so it's nothing that we can deny, that we sometimes like know that we could do better, but with like out of context, like the context constraints or directs what we do. But I think there's like before I potentially speak a bit more about the storytelling project, because that was really, really interesting. I think there's so the motives why we act more or less sustainable can be guilt, for sure, but it can also be something that we call a convention, so something we always did, or our parents or even our grandparents taught us to do so. And now, where everyone talks about sustainability and offers us all those beautiful social representations of sustainability, we suddenly realize, so my grandma always used the old kind of marmalade glasses and Nutella glasses and mustard glasses as either drink glasses or as containers for food on leftovers. So, well, that was actually really sustainable. And I don't have to be like the most famous influence and say like, oh, look at this brilliant idea. I just took this old marmalade jam glass and I'm so sustainable, because it's something like it's a convention, it's a custom, it's something, it's a habit, it's something that I always did because I was taught it by my mom or my grandma. So we have this kind of guilt as a motivator. We have something in the space of convention that we do things the right way anyway. And then of course we have something that is sometimes called like the idealism or moral imperative, something that we feel like, okay, like we need to make the world a better place, and we get really kind of not only aspirational but really idealistic, and we have a very, very high morality, a very high standards, a very strict framework of what we think is the best way to do things. What is interesting, if you look at those kind of three areas, that the conventions and the customs, like this space, is very natural, and you don't really justify it. You don't really need to talk about it because it's very kind of, okay. It's very group dependent. It's dependent on your social context, and even if you kind of move out and then you start living with some friends in an apartment, and then someone is vegan and you kind of start cooking at night, you feel like, oh, that's actually quite a nice idea. So you kind of customize a new way of living more or less naturally, very group dependent. The guilt corner, the attitude corner, is still very group dependent because you feel like you feel observed. So if other people like see me doing that, flying again, so then I might be put into a corner where I don't want to be. However, this kind of moral imperative is very much your own opinion, your own kind of passion, your own path, or your own journey, and your own fight. So that's not so group dependent or society or context related. So there's a bit of thinking around that. And in this storytelling project, what we did, and this was really interesting, maybe for then talking a bit more about ways of kind of not only social representations, but kind of visual stimuli and things that represent sustainability actually. Because what we did, like the biggest challenge for research in the sustainability space is, as soon as you talk about sustainability, everyone has this like big cloud of things in their head. So if you ask them like, what is sustainability, they potentially come up with any kind of random definition that they read or like from the media. So no one really talks about sustainability from an individual perspective. Usually you put in a lot of keywords, net zero here and green and what so on. So we wanted to develop a way to interview people without about sustainability, or without asking them for their definition of sustainability on this kind of intellectual level or reflective level, but we wanted to go deeper. And so we asked them to share any kind of random experience stimulated by these dice and visual icons. So they needed to tell a story about anything that happened to them.
I have them here.
Cool. The story cubes. Excellent.
Oh, but as everything is blurry.
They're story cubes because they have those pretty cool icons of tiny little figures doing stuff, like very random, picking something up, giving something, opening something. It's very unspecific, but really nice activities and actions. And we used them in those interviews and said, okay, throw the dice. It's 9 dice. Pick at least kind of 1, 2, or 3. Put them in a row and tell me a story, something that happened to you that you potentially relate to sustainability. And this was really interesting because we didn't ask for a definition of sustainability. So we were like, oh, doesn't matter. Like whatever you think is sustainable, doesn't matter for us. But they started to share experiences where where definitely morality was pretty strong, where feelings of guilt were very strong, where we had a lot of interviewees saying, "Oh, and I know I should have done that, but I did this." So it was still very reflective, very morally overloaded. But by the same time, it was really interesting to see that most of those stories were somehow from the past, from the childhood. So that was a very interesting observation to see. It was a lot about, and I do remember where we kind of splashed around with water all the time, and no one actually told us to not spill too much water, not or better save water. And so they started a very interesting reflection process. Another observation was that a lot, we did this storytelling exercise with the story cubes again in an international setting, and the stories are very different, but the way that people talk about it and reflect on their individual activities are very, very similar. It is like they know, but there is this behavior intention gap, which is very, very strong in the sustainability. You know, this kind of like, I know better, but still I want to have it cold, so I switch the aircon on. This kind of, I know, but, and I felt bad, and I knew I could have done. And
yeah, when you sort of self-regulate internally completely, but outside you don't regulate so much because and you also used the term of problematization in the study. Is that connected to this form of moral, to this moral regulative that people have, like also how it's used today in the form of, I don't know, so like communication about sustainability in
I think problematization is something that I see a lot of potential in for strategic communication. I think it's what happens on an individual level is more deproblematization. So it's something we call harmonization strategies, because we do not really want to kind of problematize and go deep into those things that feel uncomfortable. So we rather try to harmonize, find excuses, or find like an argument around it and say like, well, I did have to fly, I did have to do that out of these reasons, and I can't really. And part of this process is to allocate responsibility to someone else or to the system or to big corporates. Like, I don't have a chance to do better. Just like look at those big corporates and what they do. So this process of reallocation responsibility to organizations or the state or political institutions or this system or the market or this is how the world goes. Like, this is part of this kind of harmonization or this process of getting rid of these cognitive dissonances. Problematization, like here is, I'm speaking from my kind of background in public relations and strategic communication. Problematization is definitely one of those strategies that are not used very often, because usually from a corporate perspective, it's easier to harmonize, to say, oh, look how amazing we're doing, and we have this new water recycling system here, and we do a lot in terms of our stakeholder expectations and try that all our suppliers follow some sustainability guidelines. So problematization would mean to say, okay, we actually do have a problem, would mean to actually create a disruption and to be open to change. Because problematization means that you put something into question, that you actually kind of define a problem and develop a strategy to tackle it. So this is kind of core of campaigning or PR, or as it's conceptualized from a theoretical perspective, that everything like a campaign always starts with the identification of a certain problem and then a strategy that tries to solve the problem or that tries to. But problematization can happen much more intensively, and my personal opinion is that it needs to be done much more often, because if you problematize it, if you put something into question, then people start to talk about it. And this is probably the most urgent need in sustainability communication, that many more conversations need to be initiated where people start to define and redefine what sustainability is and create common sense around what sustainability is. Thinking about B2B relationship, if the supplier and the organization, if they never talk about what sustainability actually means for them, and sustainable production or sustainable transportation, they need to negotiate. They need to agree. And of course, there are heaps of guidelines and frameworks that nowadays tell the organization or the corporate business and the supplier what this common ground might be. So what is this taxonomies here and there, and more developed in each country. So everything is defined, like this is sustainable, this isn't. But like you probably read about all the discussions around the European taxonomy and why nuclear power suddenly is included in the sustainable energy resource, like things like that. But it doesn't really help, because now we have those two kind of positions, kind of like, how could they, and others like, it makes sense, at least for transition. So, but this is not the idea. The idea is that there's an open space to negotiate. What does it actually mean, like on a smaller scale? What does it actually mean for us in our relationship? So this is what I offer you. This is what you buy from me. And in this relationship, this is what we agree on. But it needs to be talked about. And it's only talked about if something is put into question, if it's actually problematized in a way that, okay, we need to define that. Someone needs to kind of say, okay, we need to sit down and talk about it.
Yeah, I find this, I totally agree. I mean, I experienced it myself a bit in putting out that I'm a sustainable photographer, for instance. We just talked about it a little bit. That there are like, we also did a lot of these kind of gestures today, like there you have these kinds of images, and then you have these kinds of images, and then you have this kind of communication, and you have this kind of communication. But actually we need to sort of find a common ground and discuss it like on a verbal level, and also to find something that sort of is not always in the extreme, but as you said before, it's like more of an imperative. It's a given. Like it's not so much an extra that you can add towards your service, but it's actually should be the standard, and not so much like a question of, oh, does this scare somebody away if I use this term to describe my service, because it's maybe not even so much like obviously related that you can be a photographer, but or in other ways, like also have this discussion about this. Yeah.
But I strongly believe that more and more of your clients, and not only the Archinoa or like clients in this, like roughly in the sustainability space, but also other business, large business, they are increasingly aware that they want to work on a B2B level with professionals and people that follow certain guidelines, and that, because then this fits to their CSR strategy, and they can say, hey, we are kind of in all our things we do beyond the organization boundaries, like in our interactions with our B2B partners, we are actually sustainable, and we can say that this product XYZ is produced sustainably.
Mm.
Because we know our resources are sustainable, we know that the person who is then presenting this works following sustainability guidelines.
Yeah. You wrote, and I think this is going to be my last question because we also sort of have been talking so long. This is amazing. That it also needs like more spaces of communication or to talk about sustainability as such. Not only that we do it, but where we do it. And what do you mean by that? Do you have a vision? Like, do you have perfect, what is your dream scenario of spaces where it should be discussed?
Perfect word. I love the question. This is probably my my job for the next couple of years to develop more concrete concepts and ideas around that. So far, I think the initial thinking was that if you think about organizations, if you think about university or a business or a non-profit organization, you always have, here comes the gesture again, you have formal communication, like the hierarchical kind of information processes. But by the same time, you have something like the coffee kitchen. You have something like the hallway, where all those chit chats and rumors and all those tiny little conversations are made. And maybe you know from like American football, they do the so-called huddle, which is this kind of like they do a certain kind of strategy and thing, and then they all kind of come back together and have it to go, oh, this worked well and this didn't work well and da da da. And kind of combining this idea, I strongly believe that this negotiation of a common belief or a common sense of a certain kind of normative framework of how do we want to do the processes that we do. This is nothing that can be set up top down and then kind of predetermined from the management and said, okay, this is how we do that. This is what sustainability is for us. This is our vision. This needs to be co-constructed bottom up. This needs to be negotiated and spoken about. So everyone in an organization needs to be involved in this conversation. And if it's with a representative of a team, and people from different teams and from different levels need to speak together. So it can't, bottom up means that from each team, that the levels in a larger organization, that they are connected to each other, that they have the opportunity to talk to each other and negotiate what they actually want to rely on. And this is just to give you an example, a very small example. In my seminars, in my courses at university, this is the first thing I do. I ask for kind of core values, and everyone kind of writes their things that they're important for them in a learning environment, what they want to kind of have, what they think is important on a post-it. We collect them at the board and then we cluster them a bit, and we see something like transparency and good communication or efficient communication. And then we have something like respect. And this comes up every time. Everyone says, oh, respect. And so we, by the end of this first bit of every seminar, we can all rely on respecting each other. And the good thing to have that is that the students feel respected, but at the same time, if they use any nice little artificial intelligence to get the seminar thesis sorted, then I can go back to them and say, well, like from a respect perspective, that doesn't really meet what we agreed on. So I have a core value that I can go back to. And my deep thinking and my vision, going beyond this idea of the communication spaces, is that sustainability becomes one of those universal values that we all agree on. And that we, like as a society, like seriously agree on. Because if sustainability is something like a universal value that we all kind of believe in, something like democracy, I think then we kind of made it, because we do believe in democracy, even like we're critical as always and how it's done, blah blah. But if this is a universal value that we all agree on, then we can be made accountable and we can make other people accountable. Say, but this is actually really important for me. But this is, again, vision speaking.
But I think, no, this is beautiful. I think this is actually really important to have a vision, because then you have something to work towards. It's like a core value in itself already.
Yeah, and it's something you can practice and do on an individual level. Like, you can do it in small, like, it doesn't mean that we necessarily have those massive societal conversations, because we don't have the media environment and these kind of big settings anymore, because it's so fragmented, the whole media sphere.
Yeah.
So we just have the public sphere where this can be negotiated, as in kind of earlier or a couple of decades ago. But what we can do is, in those small kind of settings, this is where we can create those communication spaces and those negotiations and talk about what is it that we want to have as a
This is also something that you do with your talks, actually, that you create spaces with, you invite people in to talk about sustainability. It's like I'm recommending it to everybody right now to listen into those talks, because these are just amazing, because you invite so many different people from different areas of life to talk with them, what it means to them, and then you have a beautiful exchange about that. And this is so relevant to open up the space and talk about it. I think it's really lovely. And and on this note, I really want to say thank you so much for talking to me and answering all my questions. And yes, thank you so much for being here and having time and taking time and talking with me about those things.
Thank you. No, that was absolutely amazing, and I really love the questions, and I'm very, very happy to be involved in this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you too. Great. So see you around, Franzisca. Thank you so much.
Thank you.